Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on harnessing Thanatechnology to cope with illness, death, and grief, presented by Dr. Carla Sofka. This webinar is part of the Harness Technology for Social Good webinar series hosted by the Grand Challenges for Social Work. My name is Kira Silk, and I'm the director of the Grand Challenges for Social Work Initiative. I'm going to pass this webinar over to Jonathan Singer, who will introduce us to the network and to our presenter today.
Thank you so much, Kira. It is a pleasure to be here, and I am moderating on behalf of the Harness Technology for Social Good Grand Challenge. I'm one of the co-leads, along with Stephanie Berzin, Sherry Miller, Melanie Sage, Brendan Beal, and Claudia Colton. And as you can see on the screen, we have a webpage on the Grand Challenges for Socialwork.org website where you can check out some of the publications and the resources that we have. In our working paper on practice technology for social good, Stephanie Chitat-Chan and I wrote that information and communication technology has the potential to dramatically shift and enhance social work practice in the coming decade. Integrating technology into social work and creating practice innovations through ICT will make transformative social change possible. And this quote is more true today than it was 5 years ago. Certainly, you have been experiencing the transformative nature of technology during the COVID pandemic. And today's guest is going to be talking about one of the uses or one of the applications of technology to address something that for a long time people really thought was anathema to the experience of grief and loss. Now, part of the idea of the Grand Challenge is that there is a problem that if we could solve it, it would not only improve the world for social work consumers and professionals, but really society as a whole. And so one of the things that we identified in our work on the Grand Challenge was what we were looking to do for the next decade. And these consisted of expanding internet connectivity for underserved households, developing cross-state practice parameters that would facilitate the growing trend of telehealth and online service delivery in order to reach isolated populations. And I just have to provide a commentary that the need for multi-state compacts, cross-state partnerships, and really having the regulatory and the licensing permission to provide essential services using telehealth is more true today than ever before. To create policy that employs linkage of government data to allow cross-system data sharing and mining for research, program evaluations, and policy analysis. Now, when this was written, we were thinking a lot about child welfare data, but obviously the implications around racial injustice, around the new Jim Code, around all sorts of issues related to the way that systemic oppression is built into computer systems is an essential piece of understanding what different data systems across states are collecting about consumers of social work services. We want to attract, train, and retain a generation of social workers who will apply big data for social good and integrate information and communication technologies into social work practice. I have 8-year-old twin boys. One of them is just super excited about the idea of coding. Now, he also hears me talking about suicide and social justice work, and he hears my wife, who's a researcher, talking about the work that she does with marginalized and oppressed populations. And you know, it would be amazing if he grew up and thought, wow, I can use my love of computers and programming and algorithms and integrate that with the social justice mission of social work. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about attracting and training and retaining a generation of social workers who can do this work. We want to develop test, and refine new interventions that use technology such as mobile apps, gamification, big data, and the internet and social work practice. And one of the keywords there is develop. So often social workers use existing technologies and apply them to long-standing social problems. In essence, we're hacking technology that was built for one purpose and using it for another purpose. What if social workers were on the ground floor when these tech decisions were being made? What if instead of individual social workers saying, oh, there's this new app and I think it will help me do this, or an agency says, well, what if we try and modify this program? What if the programs that were being developed had social work ethics and had our consumers in mind from the get-go? That would be a radical shift in terms of how social workers were providing leadership outside of the social work profession and being part of a revolution in technology rather than just an evolution in technology. Another thing that we want to do is to initiate and foster stronger interdisciplinary partnerships and collaborations with technologists, computer scientists, software engineers, and business management. And this ties in directly with what I just said. Imagine that you, as a social worker, are on the board of advisors for a tech startup or even an established tech group, right? Chief social work officer at Google. No product can get approval without being reviewed by the social workers. That would be amazing. Create a new set of standards and curricula and pedagogy that support technology inclusion in learning and practice across all schools of social work. Now, I have to say that one of the co-leads of the Grand Challenge, Melanie Sage, partnered with Nancy Smith and Laurel Hitchcock to write a book about technology-mediated social work practice, or social work education. The NASW Code of Ethics was updated in 2018. The NASW practice standards for technology were updated in 2017. There's been some work that's been done on this. And today's guest is going to be talking about some of the ways that we think about Thanatechnology using tech-mediated models. But this is not these aren't the only things that we need to be thinking about. Every domain of social work needs to be conceptualized with applications of technology. And then finally, expand data access and use through investment and systematizing and standardizing technological policies and practices. So one of the things that I was surprised to learn is that Microsoft developed a code of ethics for artificial intelligence. Understanding how different systems conceptualize what is just, what is good, what is right, is really essential for social workers, especially if we are holding ourselves up as a social justice profession. Now, I know that the profession's been widely criticized, especially recently, about whether or not we're actually doing that or if we're part of the problem. But I think it's a valuable thing to concede that we're not the only ones that have thought about ethics and the implications of our decisions, and to understand that there are other disciplines far outside of the quote unquote helping professions that are developing ethical decision-making frameworks for use of technology like artificial intelligence. Now, I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint for this presentation, and you can see that there are automatic subtitles. This is a feature of PowerPoint. It's possible that social workers were involved at a sort of a high level to make this happen, but I suspect that this is one of those innovations that was technologically possible, and there was enough pressure for accessibility that Microsoft built it into the most recent version of PowerPoint. These are the kinds of things that as you're sitting there thinking and you're like, oh, for accessibility, it would be great if we had this. For access, it would be great if we could do this. These are the sorts of things that everybody who's a social worker should be thinking, how can I contact the folks that are actually making these products? So I just wanted to say that we've got this upcoming webinar, September 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, virtual reality training for child welfare, presented by Dr. Chad McDonald and Dr. Matt Davis. Past webinars, which are available on the Grand Challenges website, include using digital mapping technologies to inform about COVID-19 by Dr. Tom Felke, intimate relationships, technology, and abuse, what gender-based violence framework can teach us about online danger by Megan Lindsay Brown. And then Telemental Health, What Digitally Curious Social Workers Need to Know by Lori Goldkind, Leah Wolf, Nicholas Davis, and Carolyn Artley. And now I'm going to pass over the hosting to, Kira, you're going to pass it over to Carla, who is going to be talking with us about Thanatology and technology, Thanatechnology. Yeah, as somebody who works in the field of suicidology, I see people constantly getting tripped up about that. I have a lot of respect for these surprising words, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation today, Carla. And I will say that Carla is going to be presenting for it's about 45 minutes. 45 minutes to an hour, and then we're going to be having Q&A, and I will be moderating that discussion. All right, thanks so much. And Carla, you are muted.
I'm muted. Okay, so hold on.
You are set now.
I'm set now. Okay, I've got to start sharing again because to unmute myself, I had to go out. All right, it is such a privilege to be here today and share what I've learned about Thanatechnology, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that word means in just a little bit. I think this topic today is quite relevant simply because there are so many, and my screen seems to be stuck on the first slide. Here we go. I'll get it going in a second. The headlines right now have death and grief all over them. And so I went to the CDC website yesterday and today, and for example, just updated the total number of deaths related to the coronavirus. Today, the total was 141,677, and that was up 1,047 from yesterday. The day before, there were only 473 new deaths. So I think we're starting to see a pattern again. The numbers are starting to go up and spike. But for months, you've seen headlines like I've got on the right-hand side of the screen, how the coronavirus is changing the ways we grieve and mourn the dead. That was written in April. And then, of course, in March, Scott Baronato on the Harvard Business Review wrote a really interesting article that said that discomfort you're feeling is grief. And the thing that I was really pleased to see, because I've been—
Carla,
yes?
I'm going to interrupt real quick. So we're seeing your notes pages instead of just the slides. And I know that we've,
okay.
There you go.
Okay, I thought I had it fixed. Now we're good. Okay, so I've been for years talking about how important it is to broaden the way we think about grief to include non-death losses. So when I found this tweet that was written by Maria Sosa, who's a marriage and family therapist, outlining some of the things we might be grieving at the moment, I was really pleased to see it because I know a lot of people can relate to these things now. So I imagine you all could create your own list of things that you're grieving, things that haven't happened, things that have changed during the pandemic. What we're going to spend our time today talking about is what role does digital technology and social media have in coping with life-threatening or chronic illness, impending death, tragedy, and grief, and also in dealing with non-death loss. Now, you might be wondering about this word Thanatechnology. It's actually a word that I made up in the mid-90s because for years as a death educator and a social worker doing work with loss and grief, usually talking about death was quite taboo. You didn't see or hear it a lot. When the internet was brand new, I was shocked to start seeing websites that had informational support, knowledge, and facts about death and grief. You also started to see chat groups popping up. And of course, they were kind of dinosaur chat groups with the technology that we had. So I decided it was wise for me to start following what was happening. So back in 1996, I wrote my first article about how technology was being used to educate people about death, dying, grief, and loss, or to help people cope with these things in some way. And now, of course, I've had to update that definition to include digital and social media, because the technology that we have today is so vastly different than the technology that we had in the mid-90s when the internet was brand new. Today, I'm going to be drawing on a couple different roles in my life that have influenced what I know and have learned about this topic. So, of course, my time as a social worker, my years as a social work educator, a thanatologist, or someone who studies death, dying, grief, and loss, all the research that I've done. I've also become a social media user, because what better way to understand what's happening than to witness it and participate in it myself. I've also learned a lot about this topic just by virtue of having experienced losses in my own life. And I've also experienced some interesting challenges with the learning curve as a result of being a parent. My daughter just turned 23 this summer, but I can certainly remember times when she was a teenager and a lot of these things were very new, that I had to make interesting choices as a result of what was happening in our community. And I will share some of those things with you later today. The next slide you see, you might be wondering why I'm putting a cartoon in this presentation, but I think it illustrates some of the ways that I've learned about how technology and social media are being used to cope with death. And I think it also illustrates very early in my time with you how important it is to recognize that humor is a very sensitive and touchy thing. Not everybody responds or reacts to it in the same way. So I'm going to give a little disclaimer up front about my apologies if any of the cartoons that you see are offensive to you, but I share this. This is a post from my Facebook that was posted back in 2015. My best friend Linda often shares death-related things with me. A lot of my friends and colleagues call me the death lady, because I spend a lot of my time talking about, learning about, and teaching about this topic. And when she finds cartoons, she often shares them or posts them on my feed. So on March 22nd of 2015, she posted this cartoon. Looks like he had a stroke. And then the caption, of course, is a brush with death, which is a play on words. Normally, I would laugh hysterically at this, but you'll see what I posted, because a week to the day before she posted this, my mother had had a stroke. And so I posted debating whether or not it's okay to laugh, because it was just so fresh. And then I said, dark humor is a tricky thing. And of course, underneath you see her apology. Ouch, I didn't even think of that. Please forgive me. So oftentimes people will do or say things on social media without really stepping back and thinking about what the consequences of that action are on other people. And we're going to be talking about that a lot today. So my goals for my time with you today include the following. I'm going to try to describe how Thanatechnology is used to access informational, emotional, and instrumental social support, which of course are the main types of social support that researchers say are crucial for people to cope with loss. We're going to define some new vocabulary words that have evolved, because technology certainly creates all kinds of language that, unless you keep up with it, sometimes it's really hard to follow. And it's important for us as social workers to understand what these phenomena are and to think about how we can learn more about them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks and benefits and challenges of using these resources. We're going to talk about some of the netiquette that has started to evolve for using social media when you deal with illness, death, and grief. I'm going to talk a little bit about digital legacies and digital estate planning, talk a little bit about the resources that can be used in this process, because that's another phenomenon that I think social workers need to be educated about. And we're going to talk a little bit about the implications of what I've learned for social work practice, social work education, and research. And perhaps some of these things will also just be useful in your own life. The figure that you see now is something that I came up with when I was actually on a plane going to a conference to do a half-day workshop about this topic. And I was trying to figure out a way that very quickly and visually I could educate people about all the different ways that social media and digital media are being used for people dealing with life-threatening illness, the process of dying, death, and grief. And I also thought a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because in a way, I've organized these that if you start at the bottom, these are some of the ways that these resources are used very early in the process of someone either being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness or having a sudden loss occur. And it kind of goes from the practical things of sharing that news up to how social support is created, how information is relayed, how people use these resources to memorialize people who have died, how people use them to maintain a continuing bond or an ongoing connection with the deceased, how you go about preserving someone's digital legacy and their online memorialization that continues sometimes for long periods of time, all the way up to a phenomenon called digital survivor advocacy that I will describe a little bit later in the presentation. So I hope this visual tool is kind of helpful, and I've also used it to organize how we're going to cover some of the content. The first thing I want to just remind us all of is all of the different factors that influence whether or not someone uses technology and social media, because there are certainly people who will never, ever go on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and there are others who their whole life kind of revolves around sharing what they do on these medium. So a lot of these factors influence somebody's familiarity with the technology, how comfortable they are using it, and also access to tech support. And I think we're seeing this a lot right now related to COVID, because you have older adults who desperately want to stay in touch with people but may not have been familiar with Zoom before all of this started, or may not have a smartphone that allows them to be face-to-face with people mediated by technology. And certainly we still know that there are economic barriers that prevent some people from having access to all of the technology. And of course, one of the most important things to think about is what type of personality someone has related to whether or not they are public or private with things that are happening in their life, how comfortable they are publicly asking for help or sharing their emotions or sharing the fact that they're even grieving with someone in a public venue. I love the work that Mark Prensky did back in 2001, because the concepts of digital immigrants and digital natives are useful too to think about whether or not people are using or are familiar with this technology. So are the people that you work with, your students, your clients, and you, are you a digital immigrant or a digital native? Well, digital natives have never experienced life without technology. They're the ones that got a smartphone, a tablet, started working on laptops and computers when they were very small. And I love this one because here they are all playing, You're It on their smartphones. And I think some of our students, if you're a social work educator, all of your students who are traditional age students are digital natives. Now, like myself, I'm a digital immigrant, and certainly technology is influencing our lives particularly tremendously, I think, right now, because we have to rely on it to stay in touch with people. Those of us who have been teaching have had to rely on it to teach. And although this technology, and this one's a little antiquated, I think it hits the nail right on the head, although I think now you have to reverse it. The students are the ones that are totally familiar with the technology, and it's the teachers who are struggling to learn new things. So I just put this on there because I really am missing real whiteboards right now. The other thing that you have to realize is that digital immigrants and digital natives, I think, may or may not be comfortable with how this new technology is being used at the end of life. This particular cartoon is quite phenomenal just because it talks about how cell phones can be used at the end of life. And this cartoon was actually published in 2018, so it was a little ahead of its time in terms of the pandemic now. But you'll see in this cartoon that all of the people in this story have different perspectives about whether or not a cell phone is useful. So you have the clergy member calling and telling a family member that it looks like he'll be home for dinner sooner rather than later. You've got the family members saying, anytime now, we're just thankful we could be here, which ironically, a lot of people are not able to do right now during the pandemic. And then you even got the patient in the bed saying, I better let you go, I see a bright light. So different people are going to have different reactions to the thought of using technology during times like this. This particular slide, and I'm not going to read it all, is an article that was published in Time magazine in May of this year about how the pandemic is changing not only how we die, but it's changing that for COVID-19 patients, but for everyone else, because the policies that have had to be enacted to keep people safe are also affecting people who are dying from different causes other than the virus. So this is a fascinating article if you want to go and have a look. The URL is on the slide. Right now, probably the most significant thing that people are talking about is how contact at the end of life has changed. And a lot of people have had to think about how they're going to eliminate barriers to being able to spend time with their loved ones who are ill or dying during a time when we're not allowed to do that face-to-face. Now, some people think that this use is new, but I found it fascinating when everyone was talking about this. It took me right back to 2011, 2012, when two of my colleagues and I were co-editing a book about using technology at the end of life. And one of our contributors, Jane Moore, wrote a chapter about how her hospice program was using Skype to help patients and families spend time together at the end of life if geographic distance was preventing that. So certainly there have been people for a long time who've been thinking about this. I think the necessity of using it is particularly prominent right now. There's also a program if you're interested in thinking about how to bridge the digital divide between tech-savvy folks and people who are not familiar with the technology. There's a program called Cyber Seniors that's based out of Canada that's been around for years now. And what they do is they pair teenagers and young people as digital mentors for senior citizens. So they spend time teaching seniors how to use the technology so that they can become active on social media. They know how to use their smartphones to, for example, go on FaceTime or WhatsApp. And I know this is a particular challenge because my family spent we spent time with my 87-year-old dad trying to help him figure out how to use Zoom because he was missing everyone. And it's been a real interesting challenge to try and teach him how to manage the technology. My friend Lizzie Miles, you see a tweet that she put out the other day. She is a hospice social worker, and she's been teaching me about how their efforts to use telehealth have been fascinating to try and help their families not only connect with the healthcare providers, but with other family members who don't live locally. And so here she's tweeting about the challenges with Zoom, and on the day that the patient was really, really alert, which was unusual at that time, of course, the family had some challenges getting Zoom going, so they were really struggling, but working hard to make sure that the families and the patients were getting that contact and assistance that they needed. Now, there are a lot of online resources that facilitate social support, and some of this is very old school, and these resources aren't necessarily new, but I'm always quite surprised at how many social workers that I know or students that I know aren't aware of these basic resources. So I'm going to very quickly talk to you about some of the websites that provide informational or knowledge-based support, how to access narratives that normalize or validate a person's experience, particularly caregivers who are sometimes isolated, feel like they're the only one that's experiencing things, and these websites give them the opportunity to read narratives or stories by others that can help them feel less alone. And there are also some amazing tools or apps out there that help facilitate access to basic needs or instrumental support. Those are the concrete, tangible resources that people need when they're experiencing a crisis or caregiving. So, for example, there are a couple of websites that disseminate factual information very efficiently, which can save time and energy for someone who has 20 people in their life that all need the same information. And it also provides a mechanism where friends and family can post messages of support, not only to the patient, but to the caregivers. Probably the most common one and the most long-standing one is CaringBridge, and this site is very easy to use. It's a free site, although they do have donate buttons, and sometimes they will encourage people to donate in memory of someone who's died, but they advertise it as one place to do it all. So you can share news and updates with everybody at the same time. You can communicate that information in a private space. This is where you can also activate your support community to coordinate help if you need somebody to stay with your family member while you run out and take care of errands. And also it's a place to receive emotional support and to just hold each other up. The other site that I love, I don't know if you're familiar with the term casserole brigades, but these are the schedules that communities often put together to provide meals to families who are either grieving or somebody who doesn't have time to cook because of their caregiving responsibilities. So mealtrain.com has a couple different aspects. One part of it is free, where you can coordinate a calendar or a schedule for one meal a day. And then for a one-time fee of $10, you can purchase a version of the site that does a lot more. It allows you to not only coordinate meals, but mowing somebody's lawn, scheduling rides to the doctor or other purposes, scheduling visitors so people aren't overwhelmed with multiple people coming at one time, helping with chores and tasks, whether that's childcare or housework. So this is a wonderful way. You always have those people saying, what can I do to help? This is a technological mechanism that can coordinate all of that for you. And this is a newer site called Givenkind, which does almost all of the same functions as the two sites that I've described before. It's a little bit newer, and what this one has that the other ones don't, it has a mechanism for fundraising. So if you have a family who's struggling with the costs of medical care, you can actually raise funds and they do not take a fee out for that. You can put up a wish list, so if there are concrete supplies or things that you need, or can order from Amazon, for example, you can put a wish list up there so people aren't calling and saying, what can I do? What do you need? And this site was actually created by a bereaved mom, and she knew exactly the kinds of things that she wished she'd had when she was going through that experience with her child. So it does very similar things as the other sites, with the addition of the fundraising function in the wish list. Of course, there are pros and cons to these resources. The big benefits is that it eventually can save you quite a bit of time because you're informing multiple people at once about the same information. The challenge with that is that there is an upfront investment of time that you have to start the site, populate it with the content, and figure out a way to inform people that the site is there. It does provide that consistent information to everyone who has access to it, and it can create that community of support, not only for emotional needs, but for tangible needs as well. The downside to these sites is that people have different opinions about whether this is helpful or whether it's considered an invasion of privacy. I remember last year when my aunt was ill, my cousin who lived in California, my aunt lived in New Jersey, discovered CaringBridge and thought it would be incredibly helpful to inform my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, all of the people that cared about her family. However, my aunt, when she found out that my cousin wanted to do this, she said, shut it down. This is private. No one should know about these things. So out of respect to her mom, my cousin discontinued the site. So I think it's really important for people to talk about those comforts and make sure that they make a decision that's comfortable for everyone. The other dilemma that some people have taught me about is whether or not they should continue the site after the person has died. There is the ability to continue to provide emotional and social support to the survivors after the death has occurred, but sometimes people find it incredibly uncomfortable and disconcerting to go back to a site that documents their end-of-life journey after the person who has died. So again, it has a lot to do with those comforts and preferences. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was death notification, because social media and technology are totally changing the way that bad news is delivered. So I want you to think about, do you have a preference for how, if you have to get bad news, how you would receive it? Because I know some people prefer to get that news in person, or they prefer not to be alone when it's happening. And I think technology is changing this in ways that we never could have anticipated. So one of the things I'm going to do today is share information from a research project that I did back in 2012. there was a very tragic car crash that occurred. And this is a photograph, and all of this information about this case study is being shared with the blessing of the survivors of the crash and the parents of the kids who died. So I want to put that out there right up front. In December of 2012, these 4 young people that you see on your screen were attending a basketball game for my college's basketball team down at the Times Union Center in Albany. And this is the last photograph that was taken of the 4 of them before this crash occurred. While they were driving home from the basketball game up I-87, which is the north way from Albany up to Canada, they were hit by another vehicle. The driver had been drinking. He had drugs in his system. He was clocked at 88 miles an hour. That was the speed on the speedometer when his car crashed. And he was texting at the time of the crash, because there's a documented text that was sent at exactly the time that he hit the other vehicle. So what happened was, after this crash occurred, the next morning, I read about it in the newspaper because it happened late at night. And then, as I'll talk about later, social media started getting very actively involved in the community dealing with this tragedy. I'm going to show you a screen now that has some data from this survey, because with the family's encouragement, we sent out a survey and had over 600 people respond to it to teach us about how social media played a role with people in the communities coping with these deaths, because 2 of the young people in the car survived and 2 of them died in the crash. So one of the questions we were really curious about was how quickly people found out and how they found out. The crash occurred at approximately 10:17 p.m. on a Saturday night. Within 15 minutes of the crash, about 8% of the people in the survey already knew it had happened. 18.9% more found out within 30 minutes. 27 additional percent of the survey found out within an hour, and another 46% found out within 1 to 2 hours. So it all happened incredibly quickly. How they found out, almost 1/4 of them found out on Facebook. Some of them saw about the crash on the local news because it was reported very quickly. They had to block off some lanes on the Northway because of the emergency response vehicles. So a lot of people knew from the news. 12% got a phone call. 11.9% found out on Twitter. Only 9% found out the way that I guess I would prefer to find out, which is face-to-face. And then another 9% got a text message. And it was absolutely fascinating because a lot of the high school students that responded to the survey, well, they were high school students when it happened, they were college students when they took the survey, talked about how they found out who was in the vehicle by text messaging. They would text their friends, "Are you okay?" If they got a response, they knew it wasn't them. And then some of the people in the survey started texting Christopher, Deanna, Matthew, and Bailey. They were the 4 in the car. And when they didn't get a response from one, they texted another. They didn't get a response, they knew. So within a very short period of time, people had figured out who was in the crash. And the reason we asked this question was that because one of the mothers involved, her son Christopher was in the crash, was told by the police when they figured out that it was their kids that were in the car, they drove to the crash site. And the police told them to go to Albany Medical Center, which is where the victims of the crash were being taken. By the time Christopher's mother got to the hospital, there were 30 people in the waiting room who were not related to anyone in the car because they had found out on social media about the crash and went to the hospital. So you can never know how information is going to be shared, and you can never quite know if it's going to happen in a way that you're comfortable. Now, this next slide I'm going to show you is very personal. You see a death notification Facebook style that happened for me 2 days ago. I found out that my cousin, Billy Lee, we used to call him Wild Bill, had passed away, and his sister, Gay, had posted this photograph of him dancing with my Aunt Mary Jo. And when I read the caption, It says he's in heaven dancing with her mama. And I thought, okay, he died today. We knew he was in the hospital, but we did not know that that was the morning that they were going to disconnect him from life support. So that's how I found out about my cousin's death. And then another thing that happened very quickly, this is another post by my cousin Gaylin, but you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, her brother, Jackie, who's also my cousin and was Bill's brother. You see a conversation because a lot of time people equate pictures or songs, music, places with someone. And this was one of those Stug reactions because Wooly Bully was kind of his theme song. And here you see my cousin saying, I heard this song today at the perfect time. And I learned later that this song was playing on the radio at about the time that my cousin passed. So you'll see the comments, heard this song. Yes, we did. How awesome was that? So I posted to my cousin, it's amazing how this happens. Hope it brought you some comfort. And then she responds back to me, it did for sure. So you see so many things happening in these two posts. You see a death notification occurring. You see posting memories and connections with someone who has died. And you also see an example of a continuing bond because my cousin, I think of him every time I hear it. So she's gonna always think of her brother when this song occurs. So social media is wrapped up in so many ways to this part of the process. But of course, it has pros and cons. Again, information can be disseminated very quickly, provided that the person you hope sees it actually sees it, because not everybody checks social media frequently. It can avoid the need to repeat information multiple times. So for people whose activity is very busy right after a death, that can be a blessing to be able to share information quickly. And it also allows you to link that technology to other information that's helpful. So linking it to an obituary, linking it to information about a memorial service or a vigil or some of the other rituals that traditionally are held after a death. So it can be very helpful in those ways. On the disadvantage side, you have to think about, is this the way that people should find out? And one of the terms that we use a lot right now is it your story to tell? Because in some ways, you may not be the person who has the right to share that information. And it could be that families have not posted on social media yet because they are still needing time to call or contact people privately to share that information. Sometimes information gets out that's inaccurate, and that's unfortunate because it can cause distress when that happens. You also can't control the circumstances during which somebody's going to receive it. So for example, I was at home when I found out about my cousin's death. There have been times, and people have told me stories where they find out about it at work or they find out about it in a public place, and they're not necessarily in a position to learn it right then, and they're uncomfortable perhaps with the reaction that they're going to have in a public space. The other thing that happens once it's online, it can go anywhere. You have absolutely no control over what happens to that information. And I'll share a very quick personal story about this. When my mother died, we had a very short period of time to get the obituary to the local paper and to the funeral director just because of the timing of her death. It was right before Thanksgiving. The newspaper in my hometown is only published once a week. She died on Sunday. The deadline for getting it in that week's paper was Monday at noon, so we had less than 24 hours to get all of this done. My brother had made a request that we not post anything on social media, and I was going to honor that request. One of my high school friends, the minute the funeral home published my mom's obituary online, she posted it not on her Facebook, on mine. And I got a furious call from my brother. I told you not to. I said I didn't. And for a while I was confused because I had no idea that this had happened. I hadn't been on Facebook. I didn't have time or the inclination to do that. So I think it's really important that people recognize that it may not be your story to tell, and it's not necessarily appropriate to do that unless you know that the family has done it. So what role can social workers have in helping to prevent challenges related to death notification? I think we can encourage people to have conversations about their preferences and the process for delivering this kind of news, especially if you are in a situation where you can anticipate an impending death. The tricky part is if you have a sudden or unexpected death, you may not have a whole lot of time to do that. So I think that's where you have those proactive conversations when you can. And I think COVID is providing an opportunity for people to do that. The other thing, and I've said this before, is encourage people to think before you text or post. Is this your story to tell? Are you a primary mourner? And by that, I mean an immediate family member or a significant other who is immediately and intimately connected with that person. And if the primary mourners haven't used social media to announce a death or talk about loss, don't do it. Don't instigate it for them. You need to respect those comfort levels and privacy. You can certainly post on your own page, but be aware that if your page is in somebody else's feed, or if they check your Instagram or your other social media, they might see things at a time that they're not ready for it. It's very challenging. The other thing that we can do is find opportunities for public death education. Are there social media literacy opportunities where you can kind of sneak in some things about coping with loss on social media? Because certainly young adults in this day and age are experiencing death at a much earlier age and by some more challenging circumstances than I know I did when I was 16, 17, 18 years old. So can it be woven into health education classes? Can you collaborate with the PTA so you're educating parents and young adults at the same time about these things? And certainly I do a lot of public death education through adult ed courses, and you can certainly offer courses on these topics, and community agencies often welcome them. Right now, we are experiencing this incredible time of need for virtual rituals, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this in detail, but there have been webcasting of funerals. I wrote my first article about cyber funerals in 2009, so over 11 years ago, there were companies that were providing this service. It just was typically needed for other things. So for example, they were live streaming funerals to our military overseas if they could not fly home for a family member's funeral, or if somebody's physical health prevented traveling, if someone was pregnant and couldn't travel, or it was just economically unfeasible to go. People were doing this a while back, but the urgency and the importance has taken on a lot more need right now. People are also live streaming graveside services, although the restrictions for attending a graveside service are a little less than those for an in-person funeral. There are a lot of people who are holding virtual celebrations of life and memorial services, having candlelight vigils online. I've heard about people raising a glass, doing toasts by Zoom, and doing eulogies by Zoom, which is quite helpful for people who are feeling isolated. Now, as a result of social media use during times of tragedy, all kinds of new behaviors are starting to occur. So I'm going to quickly teach you about some of them. In 2014, a communications professor, Jocelyn DeGroot, wrote an article that she described as emotional rubbernecking. And this is the behavior where someone who did not know the person who died or is very distantly acquainted and unknown to most of the primary mourners will visit the memorial page of a stranger to read what others have written and sometimes to post their own messages of grief. Now, some people talk about this as being a grief vulture or lurking if the person doesn't post anything. And a woman named Whitney Phillips wrote an article in 2011 about this phenomenon, and she actually interviewed the people who do this, because sometimes they're called memorial trolls. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what might influence a person's decision to do this if he didn't know the deceased? Well, in our survey, the families were curious because they were noticing an awful lot of this behavior. And this is what we learned, that the social norms in cyberspace allow it and generally support people for doing this. And the person is often quite comfortable being a public griever. They have an empathy or relatability factor to some part of the death or something about the deceased. Oftentimes, these people are often feeling the absence of an opportunity in the real world to openly express their grief. So it kind of provides a surrogate place for their own grief. Some people are looking for role models or inspiration from others who have survived the same type of loss. And there are a lot fewer barriers in cyberspace to grieve. There's no time limits placed on your grief, and support is there 24/7. I would prefer to call this experiential empathy rather than emotional rubbernecking, because like some others, I have a pretty negative reaction to the term. It has such a negative connotation. And what I've learned about the reasons for doing this, experiential empathy seems more appropriate. So these are some of the comments from the data set that we got related to the 518 car crash. One of the people who did not know anyone or their families had experienced the death of her own son as a teenager, could relate to that. Another person says, I was at a high school where my cousin passed away in an accident in 2010. So he knew exactly what it was like to lose someone in a car crash. And another person said, I had a lot of mutual friends that knew the victims and I wanted to support them in their time of upset. So they were visiting the websites, visiting the social media to try and learn how to help their friends who were grieving. So why should social workers pay attention to this behavior? As I mentioned before, sometimes there are triggers for grief that happen long after the original loss. Seeing pictures about a car crash, hearing songs, seeing music, other people posting memories can trigger loss for somebody with a similar history. The other reason why I think this is important is because it provides teachable moments for us as social work practitioners and social work educators to public death education efforts can occur during these times. So it's a teachable moment. As I mentioned before, there's another phenomenon that sometimes happens called memorial trolling, where someone will go onto a memorial site and post abusive or offensive comments and images onto the pages created for the deceased. And it's an absolutely horrible thing to have happen. Sometimes people aren't aware that these memorial trolls are out there, and it's distressing when it happens and they're not aware of it. This researcher actually interviewed the trolls to find out why they did it. And what she learned about their behavior was that they didn't understand why people were compelled to grieve on Facebook if you didn't know the person who died. And they honestly did not believe that the grief expressed for a stranger could be genuine. It was fascinating too. One of the trolls that was interviewed in this article experienced the death of a loved one in his own family and experienced trolling behavior, and then he finally got it. But sometimes people just don't understand. So it's important to prepare people for the possibility that this could happen if they choose to memorialize someone's page or create a memorial page. And so what we can do is to educate people about the possibility for these kinds of attacks and to become familiar with and help educate people about the privacy settings on social media and how they can block offenders and delete the offensive posts if that should happen. Not everyone is familiar with these kinds of administrative tasks. Now, the other phenomenon that's starting to happen is that people are using social media to stay connected after a death. So when I saw this cartoon, it made me laugh, because here it's kind of implying that the deceased can post from the great beyond. What I'm going to talk about with you now is how people who survive the deceased are using social media to stay in touch. A lot of the models dealing with death and grief now don't talk about moving on, letting go. It's more about how people choose to maintain that ongoing connection or continuing bond with someone who died. Now, Sue Black is a social work educator who is finishing her dissertation this summer. I'm on her committee, so I just read her dissertation write-up about the data that I helped her collect last year, and she surveyed college students about their use of social media following a death. And so this particular question was asking people if they use social media to create that continuing bond. And she found that almost a third of the students that responded to her survey were doing that. And they did it using Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, and Twitter to maintain that continuing bond with the person who had died by sharing stories and pictures about them. Some people will talk directly to this deceased, frequently asking them for advice. What should I do in this situation? Or asking the deceased to watch over them. Students also felt connected to the deceased, not by interacting with them per se, but by watching videos of them, reading posts and messages and comments about the deceased on different types of social media. Now, there were a couple of examples of this that happened after the car crash, so I've shared a couple of them with you on this slide. So here this person is missing Chris. How's heaven treating you up there? So he's making a statement about his grief, but also asking a question of the deceased. And then the one below, 2 years have gone by, but it feels like you guys were just here. Keep watching over your Shen family. Shenandoah is the name of the school where 3 of the 4 students attended. Now, one of the survivors of the crash, named Bailey, was a prolific tweeter before the crash occurred. And this is a screen capture of her Twitter feed. And I'm again showing these with her blessing because she used Twitter for a lot of purposes. She would post updates about how she was doing. She would post up because she had significant physical injuries as well as, of course, the psychological distress of having her boyfriend die in the crash. So she was posting on the anniversary of the crash, thanks for your love, prayers, and support. Even after 2 years, it's greatly appreciated. So she found a lot of benefit to doing this, but she also found a lot of distress and pain. And these are some of the lessons that I learned from her. So she found it very helpful to use Twitter as a coping strategy. Unfortunately, she was cyberbullied. Long story short, she lost several of her front teeth in the crash and had posted a picture, and somebody who wasn't familiar with how she lost her teeth was making fun of her. They were also calling her, and I apologize if you're offended by this, calling her a Twitter whore because they didn't appreciate that she was so public with her grief. But on the other side of that, she got a tremendous amount of support. But she said, not everybody will appreciate why you're doing what you're doing, and you have to have a thick skin to prepare for those bullying experiences. And she actually wrote a book about her experience. If anybody's interested in a reference to that book, I can certainly email it to you if you reach out. So there are pros and cons of using this type of social media after a death. Again, that speed at which you can send things out is an advantage for many people. It can go viral if you want it to, and sometimes it happens without even trying. Many people use Twitter and other microblogging apps to share links and photos, so those are all helpful things. The disadvantage, you can't control what happens, and it gets sent out very, very quickly. It's also very public unless you change your privacy settings. And people's comfort levels, as I've said before, vary widely with whether or not it's okay to do this. Sometimes things going viral bring consequences that you don't want. For example, one of the mothers in the car crash scenario used to drive 30 minutes away to go grocery shopping because her face, she was the public face and public voice for the families, and people were constantly coming up to her, total strangers coming up to her, giving her hugs, asking her how she was doing. And there were times when she just needed to be anonymous, so she had to drive 30 minutes away to go grocery shopping if she wanted peace and quiet. Now, the other thing about Twitter, and it leaves archival records as long as something isn't deleted. If there are backups to systems, you know, there's also the Wayback Machine. I can find things that were online in the early 1990s that are no longer there. So it just kind of depends whether you want it to be found or not. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about survivor advocacy, because I think this is another way that people are using social media to cope with loss. Survivor advocacy is when someone who survived the traumatic loss of a loved one channels their grief into action that will prevent someone else from experiencing a similar kind of loss. How this is evolving and changing with social media is that now people can use digital technology or social media to advocate for change. And often they're advocating for either a change in someone's behavior, for example, not participating in a risky activity, what they do publicly societal practices, policies, and legislation that could possibly prevent somebody else from experiencing that same loss. So there are a lot of terms for this. Some people call it cyber activism, digital activism, online organizing, social media for social change, e-activism, e-advocacy, or info activism. You're going to see all these different terms for this behavior. And this kind of advocacy is being done on all kinds of different apps. You can go to any of these and find examples. And it's interesting because when I was checking this slide, I actually had to remove Spotify because it's gone, and they change very quickly. And it's really quite hard to keep up with all the different ways that this is happening. So I'm going to very quickly talk about a couple of the cases that if you're interested in this phenomenon, I've written a book chapter about it that's in the reference list at the end that I think Kira is going to make sure participants get access to. But if you remember back in 2014, Brittany Maynard was diagnosed with brain cancer and very publicly advocated for the right to die or death with dignity because she lived in the state of California, which did not have that right, and moved to Oregon in order to have that ability to end her life with the assistance of a physician. And I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about this, but over 1 million people have watched her legislative testimony. There is on YouTube, there is a story about her case and her life that has had 12.5 million views. So it's an incredible way to get word out. And Compassion and Choices, which is an advocacy organization for death with dignity, with her blessing and her husband's assistance, have been using her story to advocate for legislation in other states. And a tremendous number of states have actually passed this legislation since her death. Back in 1994, some authors wrote about the grief, anger, social action continuum, and they talked about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They've been staunch advocates for changes in drunk driving laws as a result of losing a child or a family member to a drunk driver. TAPS is Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, Military Survivors. They also use advocacy efforts via social media, and the literature has countless examples of this. And I've written a book chapter that you can read about some of those case studies if you're interested in learning more. In the 518 case, Christopher's parents have been staunch advocates for changes in the law. The person who hit their son's vehicle had 22 tickets prior to that accident, and they cannot understand how someone with that kind of record could still be on the road. But they do an awful lot of educating about smart driving, not driving distracted, because as Regina says, the person who hit her son is the poster person for distracted driving because he was drinking, he had been using drugs, he was speeding and texting at the time of the crash. Some of you may remember in 2013, Hadiah Pendleton was killed by a stray bullet in a park in Chicago. And you may be familiar with Wear Orange Day because her friends turned a hashtag Wear Orange into advocacy for gun violence awareness. So every June 2nd, if you see people wearing orange t-shirts, or if you see a building in your community with all the lights turned orange, you will know it is in her honor. So people are advocating for gun violence prevention and gun violence awareness in her memory. Parkland, Florida was one of the most amazing examples I've ever seen of digital survivor advocacy. And what made it so unusual was that it happened within 24 hours of the tragedy. In many cases, it takes a while for the survivors to feel comfortable going public with their grief. But in this case, these high school students did it very fast and incredibly effectively. So that's just an amazing example of digital survivor advocacy. We're seeing a lot of it right now with the Black Lives Matter campaign. And I went onto the Pew Research site because they do a lot of social media related research. And I was fascinated to find a study that they did about activism in the social media age. And some of the data that they got were about the cases that happened, you know, some 7 years ago when Trayvon Martin died. So it's been going on for many years, but I think we're much more aware of it now with the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent deaths of several people that have been highly, highly visible. I was also surprised to find on babynames.com, they had a tribute page to the people who've been killed as a result of gun violence and police brutality, going all the way back to Emmett Till up to George Floyd. So I thought that was quite an amazing tribute. So not only do you have memorializing and commemorating deaths, but you have advocacy efforts going on. So I think social workers should be familiar with this because it's a tool for social action. Legislative advocacy, if you teach macro practice or policy, it's so important that you learn about this. And there is a wonderful Twitter chats that go on about this a lot. There are also a lot of online petitions that make it so easy to advocate for change and to email your elected officials. And people also use social media very wisely to educate, to raise awareness, and to build community and social support after tragedy. So for us, I think we need to think about, if you're a social work educator, what are the best places in the curriculum to help our students gain an appreciation for the power of social media as a tool for education, raising awareness, and legislative advocacy. But also, where can we help teach our students about digital survivor advocacy as a strategy for coping with loss? Because some people find tremendous comfort and power and control in being able to do something after feeling helpless. We also, I think, social work researchers need to pay attention to these topics because there's still so much we do not know. So what are the best strategies to document when this happens? The other thing that's interesting and important to understand is what factors influence whether or not somebody participates in this kind of advocacy. And most importantly, how do we measure the impact of it? Because right now there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, documentation that it's occurring, but to my knowledge, no one has figured out how to measure it yet. And I think that's going to be one of my next projects, is to find somebody who can help me create a good measure of survivor advocacy and the impact that it has. The next thing I want to do is very quickly teach you a little bit about digital death, because there's a whole nother phenomenon that's evolving about how we preserve somebody's legacy. So back in 2013, some researchers in England documented the definition of this as the death of a living being and the way it affects the digital world, or the death of a digital object and the way it affects a living being. So you have to think about it both ways. The Digital Legacy Association is a wonderful organization in England that has done a lot of work in this area. And I had the privilege of collaborating on a digital death survey with them for the last few years. So I'm going to share some information from those surveys to teach you about this. How familiar are you with these terms? Most of you, I think, have heard about digital footprints because we all have one. The other terms are less familiar. So your digital assets are all those digital things that you create during your life. Digital death, as we just defined, can happen both ways. It's when digital objects go away, or how your death affects the digital world. Your digital legacy is what you leave behind. Digital dust is just another term for that. And digital immortality is the concept that you can continue on in some way, shape, or form digitally after you die. As you can see, most people had never heard of the majority of these terms. So a lot of this is the data that accumulates online during your lifetime. Digital estate planning is now a field of law, which is kind of fascinating. So if you know people who want to become a lawyer, there's an area that there probably aren't too many people practicing in. We also know that there are challenges that can happen if you don't plan ahead for your digital legacy and your digital assets. And Virat Shavid has written a wonderful blog that if you're interested in this topic, I would encourage you to go visit her site. So there are a lot of social media policy issues that we need to be familiar with. So how familiar are you with the different policies, laws for deceased users? We asked that question in our survey, and over almost 70% had no familiarity with these concepts at all. So a lot of people don't really know what the policies are. So I would encourage you to think about, have you thought about what should happen to your social media accounts following your death? And are you familiar with what your loved ones would want? When we asked these questions on the survey, we asked first, how important was it that their social media was preserved or remained active after they died? Most people didn't really care too much, or they weren't sure. So they hadn't really thought about it. A very small percentage of the people was it extremely important, less than 5%. We also asked how many people had done planning in this respect. And if you look at the bold numbers in the no column, most people had not documented what they wanted to happen, didn't set up a legacy contact in Facebook, didn't set up Google's inactive account manager. All of these behaviors related to using social media after a death were largely not relevant. If somebody you care about dies, how important is it for you to be able to view their social media accounts? So this question flipped it. We've previously asked, do you want your stuff to be preserved? Here we asked how important it was for other people's stuff to be preserved. And fascinatingly, the numbers flipped. Almost 50% of the people said, yeah, it's important for me to be able to see somebody else's. But ironically, they didn't think it was important to preserve their own. Quite a few people were unsure about it. And I don't know necessarily whether that meant they just hadn't thought about it, or they hadn't made a decision because they hadn't talked to anybody in their life to see if it was important. So for Facebook, they have a mechanism called a legacy contact. So if no legacy contact is appointed, would you know what the deceased wishes were? Would you want the page to be memorialized? And do you even understand, or are you familiar with what that means? And now Facebook actually rolled out last year a new feature to their memorialized pages. They now have what's called a tribute page. So if you memorialize someone's Facebook, it kind of splits it in half. So on the left, you see a memorialized page, and it says the word remembering above the deceased name. And then on the right-hand side, you see the part of the screen that is new content. Because basically what happens after a page is memorialized is that the content that was posted before the person died is preserved, and you can only add to the tribute section. And I'm gonna kind of whiz through this because we're getting short on time, and I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. But you can read about these deceased user policies online if you're interested in learning more. If you do not memorialize someone's page, what happens is people will experience what's been called an internet ghost. So this is where a program-generated prompt, such as the suggestion to like something or to friend somebody, will pop up after someone has died. Most of you might remember or recognize this phenomenon from the birthday reminders that come up. And it was interesting because one author described the kind of the freak out factor can be really high if you aren't realizing that that's going to happen. And again, those stug reactions can happen to trigger somebody's grief, especially on the anniversary of a death on somebody's birthday when those reminders come up. Here's another cartoon that I thought was fun. You know, Miss Pickle says, I was knitting a scarf for Cousin Hazel, but then I remembered she's, you know, dead. I think I forgot because I still keep seeing her Facebook photo all the time. Oh, you mean she's haunting you? That's creepy. And then Mrs. Pickle says, oh, I don't mind. She has some great recipes. So again, it's very personal and very individualistic whether or not this is going to be distressing. Now, digital immortality is that idea that you can live on in a digital realm after your physical self has died. So we asked a lot of questions about how likely people were to do these things, you know, request that their social media be removed, request that social media stay active. And here, you know, you have a lot of people saying, I don't know, I haven't thought about this. And then the items on the list get a little bit more unusual. That range from making a video for family and friends that you're going to send out with help after you die to creating a physical robot that people can interact with after your death. And actually, all of these things in the bottom 3 or 4 boxes are technologically feasible right now. Whether you can afford it or whether you want it is a whole different story, but all of those things are possible. So In my Death and Dying class, we talk a lot about digital immortality and what that means. And there's actually quite a bit of literature that's evolving on that topic as well. So if you're interested in some references for that, just let me know. So how can social workers help to take care of this? So we should ask people and think about in our own lives, have you completed your digital advance directives? And there are tools to help with that. So the Digital Legacy Association has created a social media will template. Unfortunately, this violates some of the policies on social media sites because you're not supposed to give away your password. You're not supposed to give away access information by all those user agreements that people sign and typically don't read. But people are trying to figure out a way to be responsible, and more social media outlets are creating deceased user policies now. So for social workers, we need to help raise awareness, hopefully proactively, about the need to plan for these things. If you are working with someone who's dealing with a life-threatening or terminal illness, you need to check and educate patients and families about these issues and help them find resources to plan and to help facilitate those conversations about what somebody wants to do with their digital assets. We also need to, I think, start thinking about how do we incorporate conversations about the use of this technology with people who are dealing with grief and loss, and to conduct more research about the impact of its use. So, for example, I teach my students in my classes, how can you do a social media assessment and the assessment of the impact if somebody's using it when they're grieving. So what are some of the benefits? Because as we've talked about before, there are some people find it helpful. How has this affected their family and friends in the broader community? And have they used digital survivor advocacy successfully? Or are they interested in potentially doing something like that if the circumstances of their loved one's death would merit that kind of advocacy? Or have they had mixed results? Because we've certainly talked about ways that it's not helpful. Are there people that are experiencing bullying? Are there people getting trolled? Have they created conflicts in their family? Because as you heard me say, we had a very tense time, my brother and I, in that moment where he called me and asked why I had defied my promise, and we realized that it wasn't me, but boy, that was awkward and uncomfortable at a time when I really didn't need that kind of stress. And is there an impact on family and friends or the broader community that is not perceived as positive, or have advocacy efforts been unsuccessful? Because I think that can also complicate someone's dealing with grief if they're trying to make a difference and they are not succeeding. If we had more time, I could share a whole lot of other tips and strategies about Netiquette that is evolving. In the last couple of months, I updated a resource that I created a couple years ago about Netiquette for social media and grief. If you go to Siena College's website and Google my name and the word Netiquette, this PDF file will pop up. I've also got it listed on the reference page that Kira is going to provide to folks, but that document that I created has Netiquette for all of these different areas or types of uses. And I participated in a virtual funeral collective about a month or two ago, and the result of that collaboration is a document that's available at www.covidpaper.org. It is about a 48-page document that has strategies for helping people deal with death and grief in the COVID-19 era. And it is an amazing compilation of resources about online rituals, coping with loss. It's just a tremendous resource. So I would encourage you all to look at that if you're hungry for more information about this topic. And I'm going to leave you with one last cartoon. When I saw this, I thought, okay, if I have a headstone, maybe I'll put this on it where it says temporarily offline. So I hope it's been helpful to share at least a little bit of what I've learned about this topic. I do have references here. As I mentioned, I've compiled a document that Kira can give you access to if you would like to research this a little bit more. But thank you so much for your time and attention. And I guess now I will stop sharing my screen and we'll see if there's time for questions, because I'm afraid there isn't a whole lot of time left.
Carla, that was fantastic. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone who was listening. we did have a couple of questions, and so I just want to throw them out to you.
Okay.
The first one is, have you seen or do you know of resources around differences in people's legacy preferences based on their age?
Based on their age. Okay. The only thing that I would have access to would be the ages of the respondents to our digital death survey. And so if I wanted to, I could do a crosstabs and sort out who's preferring these things by age, because we did have quite an age range in that survey. Typically, younger people are interested in some of the more technologically savvy things. They're more intrigued, I think, by avatars and, and those kinds of interactive things.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of young people are not big Facebook users anymore. They're more using Instagram. They're using some of the more ephemeral technology, Snapchat, mm-hmm. TikTok, and those are so new that we don't really know how they're thinking about the longevity of those things. So to my knowledge, the digital death survey is kind of the only one. There is a gal in England, her name's Deborah Bassett, and she, to my knowledge, she's writing a book right now. She's in the process of writing it. I'm familiar with her dissertation research. She did a study that looked at digital creators, digital inheritors. And so what she created those concepts to start thinking about, all right, when you preserve your digital legacy, you are a digital creator. And then you have that time in your life where you have to decide, all right, how am I going to share or pass this along? And to who am I going to do that? And that would be your digital inheritor. So she did this study where she interviewed people about their experiences with that and what the impact of that was. It isn't published yet. So she's on, I think, she's active in academia.edu or ResearchGate. And so her name is Deborah, D-E-B-R-A, and her last name is Bassett, B-A-S-S-E-T-T. So if you Google her, actually, she's posted some of her preliminary findings publicly online. So to my knowledge, she's the only one that's done something as specific as what you're asking. And it's a very small sample, but it's a great first start at getting people to think about that.
That's great. Are there ways that people communicate about a loved one's death that are influenced by the age of the deceased?
Oh, wow. Is the person who's asking that question thinking about social media preferences?
Have no idea.
Have no idea. Yes. Okay. It popped up in the chat box.
Oh,
yes.
Yes.
Okay. And I think this is a fascinating question because some young people, and by young people I mean folks who were in high school at the time of the car crash who are now college age students, would say, yes, I published a lot on social media. So for example, something else just popped up in the chat box and it went away before I saw it.
It's okay. I will keep track of these. You just answer the questions.
Okay. So let me tell you a story about that 518 case. Right after the car crash happened, within a couple of days, memorial pages were created for both of the students who died. They were not created by the families. The families did not even know they existed for about 6 days. They were created by one of the high school classmates. And that Facebook page has over 20,000 followers. To this day, people still use it. But some of the high school age students in the survey talked about how they only did things very privately with social media. So for example, some of the friends, Christopher's friends, educated me that they would privately post messages to his voicemail, and they would text him. So they wouldn't go on social media and do it publicly, but they were doing it privately because they needed to reach out to him. There were a lot of unfinished conversations that happened between Christopher and some of his friends. And I know the behind the scenes story, but I'm not going to share it publicly. But what they taught me was that they were trying to take care of unfinished business, but they did that very privately, as opposed to posting memories. Christopher was a football captain, and so they'd post football pictures, and they posted pictures of their social interactions with him, but some of the personal stuff was done very privately. So young people were using it to kind of continue those relationships. That's where I think those continuing bonds studies that are now starting to be done are so important. Older people in my travelings are much more comfortable with Facebook. So I think if you look at trends in what type of social media is popular across different demographic groups, particularly age, you're going to see some patterns there with how people use technology to grieve. So I hope that's helpful in answering that question.
And Carla, we have one last question, and we have about 90 seconds for you to give an answer.
Okay.
And it's a real easy, quick answer. How do we prepare seniors to utilize digital tools to honor people they have lost? And do you know of free resources to teach?
Free resources to teach people. Well, what I would encourage you to do is to go to that Cyber Seniors site, because they have some information about how you can start a program. One of the things that's fascinating, there's an organization in Albany called the Albany Guardian Society, and they have done continuing adult education for years. Traditionally, they've done it face-to-face. They have transitioned all of that to Zoom. And I have been absolutely impressed and amazed at how well the seniors are doing with just instructional videos that Zoom has on their website or other social media providers have, especially if they can get on a phone and have somebody talk them through how to install stuff. So I would say I can look and see if there are any other websites that I can send to Kira that have that, but your best bet is to find an older adult's granddaughter, grandson, somebody in their life who knows how to use technology and figure out a way to Skype or talk them through and coach them. That intergenerational coaching is your best strategy.
My mom hired my daughter, who is 12, to create a series of tutorials for her friends when the pandemic started about creating Zoom accounts and using WhatsApp. So,
well, you should ask your daughter if she's willing to share those with our audience today. And I don't know if she'll give them up for free, but you'll have to negotiate that with Jonathan's daughter.
That's great. All right. I know there are more questions, but I think we're out of time. So, Carla?
If you want to give them my email address, they can email me and we can set up a time to talk. If they really want questions answered, I'm happy to do that.
That is amazingly generous.
So I'm going to type my email address in the chat box if I can find it. Or it's just my first initial last name at siena.edu. I think it was on the first slide. So if I can, I don't know if we can.
Yeah, if you just Google Carla Sofka, you'll
find me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Carla, thank you so much. This has just been amazing. And the conversation you and I had for the podcast is going to be coming out real soon. So folks will be able to review this and also listen to that episode.
Yes.
So thank you. Kira?
Yes, I want to just thank you again, Carla, for all this information that you've shared. People have been really excited, and I know we just had a comment pop up about all the ideas that people are walking away with. So thank you for bringing this information, for your wealth of knowledge and this kind of extra important information right now. For those of you who attended, I want to thank you for your time and for joining. If you're not already part of the Grand Challenges for Social Work newsletter, you can go to our website and sign up there to make sure that you receive information on any upcoming webinars. This is part of a series, and so we are having more webinars, and we have some links to past webinars available as well. And it's just a great way to stay involved and informed about this network and the work that others are doing. So thank you all again. You will receive a recording of this in about 24 hours. And I'll include Carla's email address in there as well, so that if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to her directly. And we just thank you all again for your time, and thank you, Jonathan, for moderating. And with that, we will close out.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.